Okay, let's try and transport ourselves back a bit. Picture this. Early 19th century, East Asia. You've got China, this, massive ancient empire steeped in tradition.
Millennia of it, yeah.
And then Japan, its island neighbor, kind of distinct, seemingly sealed off, secure.
And Korea, smaller, navigating its own course between them.
Right. And for a long time, this whole region, it really felt like it had this deep stability, an established
Rooted
orders.
in history, complex systems, yeah.
But that stability, that sense of secure continuity, it was about to be completely shaken up.
Oh, absolutely. And, within just a few decades, really.
Yeah.
These huge pressures, Western powers mainly, but internal stuff too.
Yeah.
It just shattered that relative calm. This wasn't just about adapting. It felt more like survival.
A real existential moment.
Definitely. These nations, they had to face this fundamental question. How do we deal with this completely new global landscape? How do we, quote unquote, modernize? What does that even mean when your identity, your structures are so deeply rooted?
And that exact moment, that sort of clash between ancient traditions and this really urgent need for change, that's what we're diving into today.
Mhm.
We've pulled together a whole stack of sources for you. Historical accounts, academic takes, analyses looking at the incredibly different paths these major East Asian players took. Japan, China especially.
A wildly different past.
We've tried to sift through it all, pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising details, and really understand the core decisions, the forces, the philosophies even, that drove these journeys.
So our mission today is really to unpack that material for you. We'll look closely at Japan's route first, then China's, compare them, contrast them.
See the consequences.
Exactly, and see what lessons, if any, can emerge from this incredibly intense, transformative time.
Okay, let's get into it. How did these two huge nations, both with such deep, proud histories, react so differently to the pressures they faced in the 19th and early 20th centuries? What were the trade-offs, the long-term impacts? This deep dive should give you a shortcut, a focused look at understanding this really complex, pivotal period.
Sounds good. Where should we start? Japan.
Yeah, let's start with Japan.
Yeah.
To really get why they transformed so rapidly, we kind of need to understand what came right before. The Edo period. That's what, 1603 to 1867?
That's right, over 250 years. And the key thing politically was the Tokugawa shogunate. The shogun, he was the military dictator, basically, held all the real political administrative power.
And the emperor?
The emperor was still there in Kyoto, hugely revered, culturally, symbolically, historically essential. But politically, a figurehead. No real governing authority during this time.
And the country itself was divided up.
Yeah, into these semi-autonomous domains, the Han, each run by a feudal lord, a daimyo. Powerful figures in their own right.
But the shogun didn't just let them run wild, right? They had ways to keep them under control.
Oh, absolutely. A very clever system, actually, called Senkin Kotai, alternate attendance.
Alternate attendance.
Yeah. It forced the daimyo to spend, like, every other year or significant chunks of time living in the shogun's capital, Iyo, modern-day Tokyo.
Ah, okay. Keep your potential rivals close.
Exactly. And often, their families had to stay in Edo year-round, effectively hostages.
Wow.
Plus, think about the cost. Maintaining residences in their home domain and in Edo, constantly traveling back and forth with a huge entourage, it was a massive financial drain on the daimyo.
So it limited their ability to build up power back home or challenge the shogun.
Precisely. It kept them busy, kept them broke, kept them under the shogun's eye. Really ingenious for maintaining central control over what was still technically a feudal system.
And Edo itself, the shogun's capital, it became more than just a political center.
Oh, massively so. By the mid-1700s, Edo was probably the most populated city on the planet.
Really? Bigger than London or Paris, then?
Quite possibly, yeah. Along with other big Japanese cities like Kyoto, the old imperial capital, and Osaka, the commercial hub. And this period saw this incredibly vibrant urban culture just flourish.
What did that look like?
Well, you had a growing merchant class, technically lower than the samurai in the sort of official social hierarchy, but they were making serious money, gaining real economic clout.
And that money-fueled culture.
Absolutely. Arts, entertainment, literature. And crucially, literacy rates were surprisingly high, much higher than many parts of Europe at the time.
So ordinary people were reading, not just the elite.
Definitely. We know about things like lending libraries, basically run to bookshops, woodblock prints, illustrated novels. They were hugely popular.
Wow.
People were even reading classics like The Tale of Genji, maybe in simplified or illustrated versions. So you had this sophisticated popular culture bubbling up. That underlying literacy and urban complexity, that's really key when you think about why Japan could change so fast later on.
Interesting. And economically, you mentioned Osaka as a hub. What else was going on,
Yeah.
despite the famous isolation policy?
Right, Sakoku, the closed country policy. It severely limited foreign contact, mainly out of fear of Christian influence and external destabilization.
So trade was minimal.
Very restricted. There was tightly controlled trade with the Dutch and also the Chinese, but only through the port of Nagasaki. That was pretty much it for over 2 centuries. Internally, though, the economy was quite dynamic. Silk was a major product, some of which was exported.
And Osaka, you mentioned it was like an early stock market.
Yeah, the rice markets there were incredibly sophisticated. They traded rice futures, essentially. It functioned as the country's economic engine room. So internally, things were developing, even behind the walls of isolation.
Okay, so you have this picture. Politically centralized under the shogun, culturally vibrant, quite literate, economically developing internally, but deliberately walled off. And then the wall comes crashing down.
Quite literally. 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry, U.S. Navy, sails right into Edo Bay.
With the black ships.
Exactly. These steam-powered, heavily armed warships. A deliberate projection of power. And he wasn't asking, he was demanding. Open up for trade, establish diplomatic relations. Now,
That must have been a profound shock.
huge. A terrifying demonstration of the technological gap that had opened up while Japan was isolated. The shogunate was thrown into absolute turmoil. Could they resist? Should they?
What did they decide?
After a lot of internal debate, they basically realized they couldn't win a fight. The tech difference was too great. So in 1854, they signed the Treaty of Peace and Amity with the U.S. Opened 2 ports initially.
And that was just the start.
Yep. A more comprehensive trade treaty followed in 1858. This one included things like fixed tariffs, controlled by the Western powers, and extraterritoriality, meaning foreigners in Japan weren't subject to Japanese law.
Ouch. Unequal treaties.
Deeply unequal and widely seen as humiliating, it really drove home Japan's vulnerability. This moment, 1853-58, definitively ended Japan's 2 centuries of isolation. The door was kicked open.
And that forced opening, that feeling of humiliation, it didn't just lead to new trade deals. It lit a fire internally, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The shogunate looked weak. They couldn't protect the country. This fueled existing dissatisfaction, particularly among powerful samurai clans in the southwest Satsuma, Choshu, who felt kind of shut out by the Tokugawa regime.
So they saw an opportunity.
They saw a crisis and an opportunity to reshape Japan. This discontent grew into a movement aimed at overthrowing the shogun entirely and, quote, restoring the emperor to actual political power.
The Meiji Restoration.
Exactly. It culminated in 1868. The last shogun resigned under pressure. And Emperor Meiji, who was just a teenager then, became the symbol, the figurehead of this new Japan.
But he wasn't really running the show himself.
Not directly. Real power was held by a small group of very capable, very driven reformers and oligarchs, mostly from those southwestern domains. They acted in the emperor's name.
And they moved the capital.
Right. Edo, the shogun city, was renamed Tokyo, meaning eastern capital. The emperor moved there from Kyoto. It symbolized the break with the past.
So the restoration framing, bringing back the emperor, was that mostly symbolic, a rallying point?
It was hugely symbolic, yes. A way to unify the nation around a figure everyone revered. But the real goal of the Meiji Restoration wasn't just going back to some ancient past. It was about radical transformation, building a modern nation-state that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the West, redefining Japan for a new, dangerous world.
Okay, so it wasn't just a coup. It was the starting gun for massive, rapid change, driven from the top down.
Astonishingly rapid.
Yeah.
The Meiji era, starting 1868, is just this whirlwind of state-led modernization across everything: government, military, economy, education, society. They systematically looked west for models.
Cherry-picking the best bits.
Pretty much. They sent missions abroad, studied different systems: German military, British Navy, French education initially, American industry, and adapted what they thought would make Japan strong quickly.
Let's break down some of those key areas. Education, you mentioned. How central was that?
Absolutely fundamental. They saw it as the bedrock for creating modern citizens and a unified nation. By the 1870s, they'd set up a compulsory education system.
Compulsory. That early.
Yes. Initially based on French, then German models. And it worked. Literacy rates shot up. By around 1910, basic literacy was widespread across Japan.
Which is incredible.
It is. But it wasn't just reading, writing, arithmetic. A huge part of the curriculum was moral culture. Shushen.
Moral culture, what did that involve?
It drilled in loyalty, duty, obedience to the emperor, service to the nation. Education was explicitly a tool for nation building, for forging this new national identity around the emperor,
Yeah.
not just imparting knowledge.
Fascinating. So embedding loyalty right into the school system.
Deliberately. And language-wise, it's interesting. They obviously used Chinese characters, kanji, which they'd adopted centuries before, but they also had their own phonetic scripts, hiragana and katakana.
All right.
And hiragana historically was kind of seen as more, well, feminine. It's what Murasaki Shikibu used for the tale of Genji 1,000 years earlier. Men often preferred kanji. But they used this mix, modernized around it.
Okay, so education was key. What about the military? After the shock of Perry's ships, that must have been priority number one.
Absolutely top of the list.
Yeah.
They needed a modern force, fast. They built a conscript army and navy. No more relying on the samurai class.
Conscription. So ordinary people were drafted.
Yes, introduced in the 1870s, it was a huge social change, dismantling the samurai as a distinct warrior class. Everyone served the nation now.
And who did they model the new military on?
Primarily the Prussian leader German army. Known for its discipline, its general staff system, centralized command, very efficient. The Navy looked more towards Britain's Royal Navy.
And this wasn't just for defense, was it?
No. A strong military was seen as essential for international respect, for being treated as an equal by the Western powers. In that era, military strength was national strength. It was about projecting power, gaining prestige.
Okay, education, military. What about the government itself? You can't run a modern state with feudal domains.
Exactly. The old Han system was scrapped completely, replaced by a centralized system of prefectures, like administrative districts, directly controlled by Tokyo. Much more efficient.
And politically, were they building a democracy?
Well, sort of, but very cautiously. They knew they needed modern institutions, but they were also worried about instability, dissent, so there was strict censorship. Controls on political groups. Then in 1889, they promulgated the Meiji Constitution, created a parliament, the Diet, but voting rights, the franchise, were very restricted initially. Only about 1% of the population, wealthy male property owners, could vote.
So not exactly democracy for all.
Not at all. And the Constitution itself, heavily influenced by German legal thought, gave immense power to the executive branch of the cabinet, acting in the emperor's name. The emperor himself was declared sacred, inviolable, and crucially, the supreme commander of the army and navy.
That sounds significant. The emperor as commander-in-chief.
It would prove to be very significant later on, yeah.
Yeah.
It gave the military a direct line to the ultimate authority, bypassing the civilian government to some extent.
Okay, so government centralized, military modernized. What about the economy? How did they kickstart industrialization?
The state was incredibly hands-on. They poured government money into building infrastructure. The first railway line, Tokyo to Yokohama, opened in 1872. A huge symbol.
What industries did they focus on first?
Textiles were key early on. Silk reeling, cotton spinning. They imported Western machinery, hired foreign technicians to teach the Japanese how to use it. They also sent loads of students overseas to study science, engineering, business.
Bringing the knowledge back home.
Exactly. And the government actively nurtured these huge industrial and financial conglomerates, the zaibatsu.
Ah, like Mitsubishi.
Exactly. Names still familiar today. These were often family-controlled groups, sometimes with roots stretching back to Edo period merchants. With state backing, they diversified rapidly into shipbuilding, mining, banking, international trade. They became dominant forces.
So a real partnership between the state and big business.
Very much so. That state guidance, that close relationship with the zaibatsu, was a defining feature of Japan's incredibly fast industrial takeoff. It laid the groundwork for Japan becoming a major global economic power later in the 20th century.
But all this rapid change, this aggressive importing of Western ways, it must have created huge tensions internally, right? This pull between becoming modern and staying Japanese.
Oh, a massive ongoing debate. It was the central intellectual and cultural question of the Meiji era and beyond. How do you get the power, the technology, the respect of the West without losing your soul, without just becoming a copy?
Were there key figures driving that debate?
Absolutely. One of the most influential was Fukuzawa Yukichi. He lived right through this transition, 1835 to 1901. Started as a low-ranking samurai, ended up as this passionate champion of Western learning.
What was his argument?
He studied Dutch, then English, traveled to America, Europe, translated Western books. He argued very forcefully that Japan needed to, in his words, kind of shed its Asian characteristics and fully embrace Western civilization politically, culturally, to be treated as an equal.
Become part of the West, essentially.
That was his view. He wrote incredibly popular books like An Encouragement to Learning, argued for individual independence, practical knowledge, famously used a phrase adapting the American Declaration of Independence, saying, "Heaven did not create men above men, nor set men below men," using it to push for equality through education. Radical stuff for the time.
Wow. But not everyone agreed with just ditching Asian roots.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
You had thinkers like Miyake Setsure writing a bit later. He represented a strong countercurrent, argued for national pride, for preserving Japan's unique spirit, its institutions, its culture.
So modernize, yes, but stay Japanese.
Exactly. For Miyake, modernization meant taking the useful tools from the West's science, tech cast, but using them to strengthen and preserve Japan's core identity, not replace it. Adapt, don't just adopt wholesale.
That tension seems really fundamental.
It was. And it didn't go away. Much later in the 1940s, during the war, there was this famous symposium called Overcoming Modernity. Thinkers like Nishitani Keiji were asking, in chasing Western science and philosophy, have we lost something vital? Our unique Japanese moral energy, our spiritual core.
So even after decades of modernization, they were still grappling with this.
Deeply. It shows just how persistent that tension was.
And this intense drive for national strength, for equality, for maybe even superiority, it had a dark side. It fueled aggressive nationalism, didn't it? Expansionism.
It seems almost inseparable in the context of the time. For many leaders, building an empire, securing resources, projecting power overseas, that was what being a great power meant. Look at Britain, France, Germany, the US. They all had empires or spheres of influence.
So Japan felt it needed one too, to be in the same league.
That was the logic, and they pursued it ruthlessly.
Which led to war pretty quickly.
Very quickly. First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95. Japan decisively defeated China, gained Taiwan, influence over Korea, a huge shock across Asia.
And then they took on a European power.
The Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05. Japan defeated Imperial Russia, astonishing for a non-Western nation at the time. Secured dominance in Korea, foothold in Manchuria.
And Korea itself.
Formally annexed in 1910. Became a Japanese colony, brutally ruled.
And these military victories, they must have further empowered the military within Japan.
Hugely. Remember that constitutional setup. Emperor as supreme commander. The military already had significant political clout. These victories boosted their prestige, their influence immensely.
Leading to more expansionism.
Increasingly so.
Yeah.
The military leadership gained more and more sway over foreign policy, pushing for expansion in Manchuria than China proper. This dynamic ultimately pulls Japan towards World War II.
And was there opposition to this?
There was, but the sources suggest it became increasingly difficult, even dangerous, to oppose the military line. The combination of intense nationalism, reverence for the emperor, the military's prestige, and frankly, fear, tended to silence dissent. Plus, maintaining this huge military machine required heavy taxes, a burden people felt, but questioning it was hard.
So Japan's path. Incredibly rapid, state-led transformation, selective borrowing from the West, an intense internal debate about identity, building industrial and military might, and ultimately channeling that into aggressive empire building. A deliberate, high-stakes gamble for power and survival.
A really dramatic, focused response to external pressure. Leveraged some existing strengths, like literacy, but with profound consequences, both good and bad, internally and externally.
Okay. An intense story. Now let's pivot. China. Same era, same global pressures, but wow, what a different journey.
Profoundly different, yes. You start the 19th century with China under the Qing dynasty, ruling since the 1600s. A vast continental empire. Thousands of years of imperial tradition, a sophisticated bureaucracy, a deep sense of, well, cultural centrality. The Middle Kingdom.
Seemingly secure at first glance.
On the surface,
Yeah.
perhaps. But they were already facing serious challenges internally. Huge population pressure, growing social unrest, corruption, and massive rebellions were brewing, or already happening. The Taiping Rebellion later in the century was just catastrophic.
Yeah, millions died.
Tens of millions, possibly. It ravaged huge parts of the country and massively weakened the king state. And at the same time, they're facing this growing pressure from the West.
The trade issue again.
Primarily, yes. Western nations, especially Britain, wanted Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain.
Yeah.
Hugely popular, but China wasn't really interested in buying much from the West.
Leading to a trade imbalance, silver flowing into China.
Exactly. Which the British, particularly the powerful East India Company, didn't like. They needed something the Chinese would buy to balance the books.
And they found it. Opium.
Grown in British India, smuggled into China in massive quantities, it worked in a horrifying way. Addiction became rampant, social order frayed, and crucially, it reversed the silver flow. Now, silver was hemorrhaging out of China to pay for the opium.
Causing an economic crisis for China.
Severe one,
Mm.
and a moral crisis, too. The king court was deeply alarmed. They tried to crack down.
Lin Zexu, right.
Right.
Confiscating the opium.
Yes, in Canton, 1839, he seized and destroyed vast amounts of British opium. That gave the British the pretext they wanted.
The Opium War.
1839 to 1842. It wasn't really a war, it was a rout. British naval power, gunboats, modern rifles against traditional Chinese forces. China was utterly defeated.
And the consequences.
Humiliating. The Treaty of Nanking and others that followed. China forced to pay huge indemnities, cede Hong Kong to Britain, legalize the opium trade, open up numerous treaty ports to foreign residents and trade, and accept those unequal terms like fixed tariffs and extraterritoriality.
So a massive blow to king authority and prestige. A wake-up call, like Perry was for Japan.
You'd think so. It certainly revealed China's military weakness starkly.
Right.
But the response was very different from Japan's. Much, much slower. More fragmented.
Why the difference?
Several factors, probably. China's sheer size and diversity made centralized, rapid reform harder. The king court itself was divided, with strong conservative factions deeply resistant to adopting barbarian Western ways. And the existing imperial system was so deeply entrenched.
So there were reformers, but they struggled to gain traction.
Yes, there were thinkers who saw the writing on the wall. People like Kang Yue, Liang Qikao later in the century. They advocated for significant reforms, a modern administration, new education, military upgrades, even constitutional monarchy, arguing China needed to learn from the West, and even from Japan after its rapid rise, to survive.
But their ideas didn't really take hold at the top.
They had moments of influence, but faced huge resistance. The dominant approach for a long time was called self-strengthening. The idea was basically, let's adopt Western military tech guns, ships, and maybe some industrial methods, but keep our fundamental Chinese culture, our Confucian values, our political system intact. Bolster the system, don't replace it.
Chinese learning for the essence, Western learning for practical use, that kind of idea.
Exactly that phrase. But it proved insufficient. Tinkering wasn't enough against the scale of the challenges.
And you mentioned the imperial system being entrenched. Was the civil service examination system part of that resistance to change?
Hugely important.
Mhm.
This system had been the bedrock of Chinese bureaucracy for like 1,300 years. It was how you got ahead, how you gained power and status,
And it was all based on.
mastering the Confucian classics, philosophy, history, literature, poetry. Incredibly demanding intellectually. Millions studied for it. By the mid-19th century, maybe over 1 million candidates participated in the exams across the empire at various levels. Although only a tiny percentage ever passed high enough to get a government job.
So the brightest minds were focused entirely on ancient texts, not on science, engineering, modern economics, things needed to confront the West.
Precisely. It channeled the nation's intellectual energy into preserving tradition, not into innovation or adapting to new global realities. It produced brilliant scholars and administrators within its own framework, but that framework was becoming obsolete in the face of industrialized powers.
So it was a barrier to modernization.
A major one. It took until 1905 for the Qing government, finally, belatedly, to abolish the examination system altogether. A massive symbolic and practical break, but maybe too late by then.
As China kept facing setbacks, losing to Japan in 1895, the Boxer Rebellion fiasco leading to foreign troops occupying Beijing, this must have deepened that sense of crisis, of vulnerability.
Immensely. There's this really telling idea mentioned in the sources that some Chinese intellectuals started to feel China was becoming like Poland.
Poland? Why Poland?
Because Poland, in the late 18th century, had been carved up and literally wiped off the map by its powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, Austria. The fear was that China was next, that these foreign powers, with their spheres of influence, their treaty ports, their demands, were effectively partitioning China, treating it like a territory to be exploited, not a sovereign nation, a feeling of becoming a non-country.
A terrifying prospect. And the Qing dynasty just couldn't stop the rot.
Ultimately, no. They tried reforms, too little, too late. The combination of internal decay, massive rebellions, repeated military defeats, economic disruption, and national humiliation just eroded their legitimacy completely.
Leading to the 1911 revolution.
Exactly. It started with a mutiny among modernized army units and quickly spread. Provinces declared independence from Qing rule. The Manchu dynasty was overthrown. The Republic of China was declared in 1912.
And the figurehead of this new republic, the founding father, was Sun Yat-sen.
Sun Yat-sen, yes, a pivotal figure. Trained as a medical doctor, spent years abroad, deeply influenced by Western ideas, but also a passionate Chinese nationalist.
And he had a specific vision for China.
He did. His famous three principles of the people, Minzui: first, nationalism, get rid of Manchu rule, which was seen as foreign, and resist Western imperialism, unite the Chinese people. Second, democracy, establish a republic, representative government. Third, people's livelihood, focus on economic development, land reform, social welfare.
He founded a party based on this.
Yes, the Kuomintang, GMD, or the National People's Party, still the ruling party in Taiwan today.
But establishing the republic didn't magically fix China's problems, did it?
Far from it. If anything, the decades after 1912 were even more chaotic. The republic was weak from the start.
How so?
Real power didn't stay with the central government in Nanjing or Beijing for long. It fractured. Regional military commanders, the warlords, seized control of different provinces or areas. They had their own armies, taxed the locals, fought each other constantly. China broke apart, effectively.
So total fragmentation. And what about the political parties?
Well, you had Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang trying to unify the country. But then, in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, was founded. Initially small, influenced by the Russian Revolution, they sometimes allied with the GMD against the warlords, sometimes fought them. It was incredibly complex.
Warlords fighting warlords, GMD fighting warlords, GMD and CCP, sometimes cooperating, sometimes fighting.
A total mess.
Mm-hmm.
And then, layer on top of that,
Japan.
Japan. Increasingly aggressive, seeing China's weakness as an opportunity. They seized Manchuria in 1931, creating a puppet state, then launched a full-scale invasion of China proper in 1937.
Which must have been absolutely devastating.
Unbelievably brutal. Millions killed, huge parts of the country occupied. This war against Japan lasted until 1945, and it happened alongside the ongoing internal conflicts. It was during this period of desperate resistance and internal struggle that the CCP really grew.
And Mao Zedong rose to prominence.
Yes. The Long March in 1934-35, though a military retreat that cost them dearly, became legendary. It cemented Mao's leadership and saved the core of the communist movement.
What was distinctive about Mao's approach? You said the CCP focused on the peasantry.
That was key. Unlike traditional Marxism, which focused on urban factory workers, Mao realized China's revolution had to come from its vast rural population. He and the CCP focused on organizing peasants, promising land reform, mobilizing them for guerrilla warfare against the Japanese, and, eventually, the GMD. They built their power base in the countryside.
And they pushed social reforms, too, you mentioned, especially for women.
Yes, this was a significant part of their appeal in some areas. In the regions they control, the CCP set up women's associations, challenged traditional practices like arranged marriages, made divorce easier. It offered rural women, particularly, a glimpse of a different life, a degree of agency. There's that study mentioned in the sources, Mao's detailed survey of Sunwu County in 1930. He wasn't just sitting in an office. He went down, looked at local markets, land ownership, social customs, even things like how women were treated, patterns of exploitation. It shows this real focus on understanding the grassroots reality, believing that solving these deep social problems was key to the revolution's success.
So this incredibly long, painful period, warlords, civil war, Japanese invasion, more civil war finally ended after World War II finished.
The war against Japan ended in 1945, yes. But the civil war between the GMD, now led by Chiang Kai-shek, and Mao's CCP flared up again almost immediately, and with greater intensity.
And the communists won.
They did. By 1949, the CCP forces had defeated the GMD armies decisively. Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of his government fled to Taiwan.
And on the mainland.
October 1st, 1949. Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC. A completely new chapter began.
Focused on building a communist state.
Exactly. Consolidating CCP political control, transforming the economy through central planning, land collectivization, aiming for rapid industrialization, and huge social campaigns to reshape society.
But not without turmoil. The Cultural Revolution.
Right. That period, roughly 1966 to 1976, was incredibly chaotic. Meant to purge bourgeois elements and rekindle revolutionary spirit. It led to widespread persecution, violence, economic disruption, and severe damage to the education system. A deeply traumatic period.
And later, after Mao, China started to open up economically, didn't it? Though still under party control.
Yes. Starting around 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. Major reforms introduced market forces, encouraged foreign investment, dismantled the collective farms. The goal was rapid economic growth, modernization, lifting millions out of poverty. but always, always under the firm political control of the Communist Party. That balancing act, market economics with one-party rule, often called socialism with Chinese characteristics, defines China's path right up to today.
Okay, so China's journey. A much slower initial reaction, hampered by internal problems and tradition, decades of fragmentation, warlordism, civil war, devastating foreign invasion, culminating in a communist revolution that completely remade the state and society, followed by periods of upheaval and then pragmatic economic reforms under continued party rule.
A radically different trajectory compared to Japan's swift, state-led Meiji-era transformation. Two giants facing similar pressures, finding vastly different answers.
Let's talk about what happened after World War II for both, and maybe bring in Korea briefly, because its path was different again. Japan first, utterly defeated in 1945.
Devastated. Cities firebombed, 2 cities hit by atomic bombs, then occupied by the U.S.-led Allied forces until 1952.
And the U.S. occupation wasn't just passive. They actively reshaped Japan.
Oh yeah, profoundly. General MacArthur oversaw huge reforms. Demilitarization was key. The Imperial Army and Navy disbanded. The big zaibatsu conglomerates were initially broken up, though many reformed later in different ways. Major land reform redistributed land from large landlords to tenant farmers.
And a new constitution.
A brand new constitution, largely drafted by the Americans, implemented in 1947, established parliamentary democracy, guaranteed civil rights, and, crucially, included Article 9.
The Peace Clause.
Renouncing war as a sovereign right, a fundamental shift, turning Japan away from the militarism that led it to disaster.
And despite all that destruction, Japan then experienced its famous post-war economic miracle.
Astonishing growth, yeah. From the 1950s to the 80s especially, Japan became an economic superpower.
How did they manage that from the ruins?
Several things came together. One, they still had the foundations, that skilled workforce, the industrial know-how built up since Meiji. Two, the democratic reforms arguably unleashed new energy and participation. Three, the state, particularly ministries like MIT, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, played a really smart guiding role, coordinating industrial strategy, focusing on exports. Four, U.S. help was critical aid, opening U.S. markets to Japanese goods, and the Korean War provided a huge economic boost through military procurement.
Right, the Korean War connection. So Japan rebuilt as a democracy, allied with the U.S., focused on economic growth under that peace constitution.
That's the post-war trajectory, yes.
And China, after 1949, consolidated under the CCP.
Yes, focused on building socialism. The initial decades saw huge state-driven efforts in industrialization, collectivization, social campaigns. Then, as we said, the shift towards market reforms from the late 70s onwards, leading to explosive economic growth, but within that same political framework, rebuilding and transforming under communist rule, balancing state control with economic goals.
Now, briefly, Korea. Another major East Asian player, but a different story again.
Very different and tragic in many ways. First, decades of harsh Japanese colonial rule, 1910 to 1945. Then, liberation, but immediately followed by division, Soviet back north, U.S. back south.
Leading to the Korean War.
1950 to 53. Absolutely devastating. Cemented the division that still exists today. Left both Koreas in ruins.
How did South Korea then pursue modernization?
South Korea's path also involved rapid industrialization, but under very different circumstances. For decades, it was under strong authoritarian rule, particularly General Park Chung-hee from the 60s into 70s.
So not democratic like post-war Japan initially.
No. Park pushed an aggressive, state-directed, export-oriented strategy, targeted specific industries, textiles first, then heavy industries like steel, shipbuilding, later electronics. The state worked very closely with and fostered huge family-controlled conglomerates, the chaebol like Samsung, Hyundai, LG.
Similar to Japan's zaibatsu.
Similar in scale and state support, but different structures. Very effective economically, though. South Korea transformed from poverty into a major industrial economy.
But this happened alongside political repression.
Yes. That's the crucial difference with Japan. Economic development under Park and his successors came with suppression of dissent, limited political freedom. But, and this is also key, there was always a powerful, persistent demand for democracy from South Korean citizens.
Major protests.
Yes, significant democratic movements. A student uprising in 1960 forced a president out. Massive protests in the 1980s eventually led to direct presidential elections and a transition towards genuine democracy. Even recently, huge peaceful protests in 2016 led to a president's impeachment. So South Korea's path is this really interesting mix. Very strong state-led economic drive, but also a powerful, successful, popular struggle for democratic rights. A third way, if you like.
Fascinating. Okay, so if we try to compare the two roads of Japan and China directly, what are the core contrasts?
Starting points, definitely. Japan had relative internal stability, a unified structure under the shogun, even if feudal. China was vast, diverse, already grappling with huge internal decay and external threats simultaneously, made a coherent, fast response much harder.
Catalyst and pace?
Japan. Sudden shock. Perry. Triggers rapid, top-down revolution. Meiji. State drives modernization immediately. China. Earlier shocks, opium wars, but slower, fragmented response leads to decades of internal chaos before revolutionary conclusion. The pace is completely different.
And how they dealt with the Western tradition?
Both deeply influenced, obviously, but Japan seemed more maybe pragmatic, ruthlessly selective, adopted Western forms to achieve national strength, were constantly agonizing over identity. China, with its deeper, more rigid Confucian tradition, seemed to struggle more profoundly with reconciling change, leading to more internal conflict before a radical break with the past via communism.
The nature of the conflict they experienced?
Japan's path involved external aggression, building an empire alongside the internal political shifts of the Meiji state. China's story is dominated by internal conflict for decades. Rebellions, warlords, civil war, massively compounded by brutal foreign invasion.
And the end results? Post-war.
Both achieved significant economic success, undeniably, but through totally different systems. Japan, integrated into the global capitalist economy, democratic, post-WVII, under a U.S. security umbrella. China, developed under Communist Party rule, evolving its own model of state capitalism, charting an independent, often challenging course globally. Two distinct modern nations forged in very different fires.
It really underscores that modernization wasn't some off-the-shelf package they could just import.
Not at all. It was contingent, path-dependent, shaped by unique histories, choices, accidents, leadership. These sources show how different decisions, different circumstances, lead down profoundly different roads. History doesn't offer easy answers, but it sure offers powerful guidance or warnings.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The immense pressures on East Asia from the 19th century, the starkly contrasting choices made by Japan and China, Japan's breakneck, state-led transformation and imperial drive, then its democratic rebuilding. China's longer, more painful struggle through internal division and revolution to forge a new path under communism, and Korea's unique experience too.
It's a history full of dramatic turning points, hard choices, and outcomes that continue to shape our world today.
So as you've listened to this, as you've taken this journey with us through these complex histories, what really stands out to you? Is it the sheer speed, the audacity almost, of Japan's Meiji Revolution after centuries of isolation? Or is it the scale, the depth, the tragedy, perhaps, of China's century of turmoil before finding a new unified path?
It certainly complicates any simple definition of modernization, doesn't it? These sources show it's not just about technology or GDP figures. Japan tried to fuse Western power with its own culture, a path that led to expansionism before finding a different balance post-war. China underwent a total societal upheaval to build a system balancing economic progress with tight political control. Korea managed rapid growth while its people fought for and won democratic freedoms.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe. Based on these very different, very complex, sometimes very costly national journeys, is true modernization ever just about adopting new tech or new economic models? Or is it always this incredibly difficult, maybe never fully resolved process of integrating massive external change with a society's own deep-rooted culture, politics, identity, trying to find a viable synthesis?
And flowing from that, is there an optimal balance? Is there a way to achieve the progress, the strength, the prosperity that modernization seems to promise without paying the kind of immense human costs that Japan, China, and Korea all paid in different ways along their paths? That's a heavy question, but one their histories force us to ask. Something to definitely consider as we look at similar struggles for development, identity, and security playing out across the globe today.